Most writers understand that writing a character with no flaws is a huge turnoff to readers. Seriously, it's hard to feel connected to someone who is perfect and does everything right. But how do you give your protagonist flaws that feel real and authentic instead of superficially layered on? Well, worry no more because in this episode, we are going to talk about exactly how to discover your protagonist's authentic flaws, the ones that will make your readers connect with them and love them in spite of all of their failings. Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world, too. A couple of years ago, I was reading a new client's pages, and the protagonist's behavior in a number of scenes didn't seem to make sense given their backstory and their goals. In short, things weren't adding up. So, of course, I dusted off one of my very best coaching tools. I started asking why. Why is the protagonist risking everything to lie to their mother when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose? Why are they putting their family at risk to use their magic in a public location when magic is illegal in this world and they might be arrested? When I met with my client a few days later, she confided in frustration that she was terrible at giving her protagonist flaws. Her protagonist would inevitably end up as the very best version of a person, sort of everything she wanted to be, her avatar in the game. Smart and witty and beautiful and sassy and wise and good at everything. You know, exactly the type of person that nobody wants to read about. So, to make her protagonist more believable and more likable, she went to a writing website and perused a list of character flaws. After a while of combing through that list, she picked a couple of good ones: lying and impulsiveness. And suddenly I understood the problem completely. She was layering flaws onto the top of her character instead of baking them into her character, which is a faux pas that can completely destabilize a narrative and make the protagonist seem more than a little unhinged. And if you want to prevent that from happening to your novel, there are 4 steps that you need to take to uncover the flaws that make sense for your protagonist and fit in with the larger narrative. Step 1. You need to know the point of the novel you're trying to write. If you're not sure what a point is, don't worry, I've got you covered. The point is just the main message or lesson of your novel. It's the thing that you, the writer, want to say about people or about the world. And it just so happens to be the thing that your protagonist will learn by experiencing the events of the plot in your novel. As you might have guessed, knowing the point of your novel is really the first step in writing your novel, and it's the starting place for understanding what kinds of lessons your protagonist needs to learn and what kinds of flaws they might have. The point is just a short statement that is generic enough to feel absolutely universal to everyone who reads the novel. But don't worry. You will never directly state the point of your novel in your novel. Instead, it's just a guiding statement that helps you figure out all of the other elements of your manuscript. An example of a point is this: it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. You might be thinking, wow, that's pretty darn cliche. Yep, you're right, it is. But that's what makes it universal. That's what makes it a good point. In fact, I could argue that that cliche statement is the point of one of my favorite speculative fiction novels, a lovely book called They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. That novel is about 2 young men who meet on the day they know they'll both die. But despite knowing their fate, they choose to spend their remaining hours together, building a deep and meaningful connection. Okay, it's just about time to move on, but if you're interested in understanding more about what a point is and how to develop one for your novel, please go listen to episode 1 of my podcast. In that episode, I deep dive into the point and I give you a very snazzy workbook that will take you through developing your novel's point step by step. And don't worry, I've dropped a link to that episode and a link to the workbook right in the show notes of this episode, so it will be super simple for you to snag those. So go ahead and do that right now if you're feeling a little bit shaky on what a point is or what the point of your novel might be. All right, step 2. You must know your protagonist's misbelief. A misbelief is basically the starting place of your protagonist's character arc. It's the thing they believe about themselves or about people or about the world that isn't true, and it's messing up their life, preventing them from achieving true happiness. And as a bonus, it's basically the opposite of the point of your novel. So, if you uncover the point of your novel, the misbelief is pretty easy to figure out because you just think, oh, okay, well, what would be the opposite of this point that someone might believe? Using They Both Die at the End as an example, the protagonist Mateo believes that putting himself out there in the world and loving people is too dangerous because when he loses them, and he will, the pain will be just too much to bear. Notice how the point of that novel, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, and his misbelief that it's too dangerous to love people are the opposite of each other. So the novel is really there to teach Mateo this lesson, to take him from this misbelief all the way to a healed belief, which is the point of the novel. Step 3. Know your protagonist's wound. The wound, sometimes called the shard of glass, is an event or series of related events that typically happened early in your protagonist's life and gave rise to the misbelief. Simply put, a specific bad thing happened to your protagonist and it caused them to form a belief that's incorrect. If you think about it, this makes perfect sense. As humans, we all have wounds that give rise to misbeliefs, but we might never face life circumstances that challenge and heal our misbelief. We might actually be stuck with our misbeliefs. But your protagonist is lucky. They have you and the events of your plot to help them through it. So this means that your job as the storyteller is to dig deep into your protagonist's past and find out what the heck happened to them. Specifically, what happened to them, not generally. In fact, don't just think about or daydream about the events that caused your protagonist's wound. Instead, actually write out the scene or scenes that formed their misbelief. That way, you can really figure out how it affected them in the moment and the damage that it did. Bonus, even if you don't use these scenes in the final version of your novel, you will still have it there to draw from as you sprinkle backstory throughout the narrative. So it's just a good idea to have these scenes available. Again, using They Both Die at the End as an example, Mateo's wound actually happened incredibly early in life when his mother died giving birth to him. Growing up in the shadow of her death and watching the pain his father experienced due to that loss created within Mateo a deep fear of living and of being vulnerable to love. Then, to make matters worse, just before the opening of the novel, Mateo's father suffered a stroke and ended up in a coma, confirming what Mateo most feared about loving people, that you always lose them and that the pain is too much. Okay, drum roll please. Step 4. Develop your protagonist's flaws. So now that you know the point of your novel, you know your protagonist's misbelief, and you know your protagonist's wound, it is time to use this information to build compelling, authentic, and believable flaws for your protagonist. And here's the great thing, now it's just about following basic psychology. So ask yourself, given what happened to your protagonist that caused their wound, and given their subsequent misbelief, what flaws would naturally make sense to have formed? What kinds of personality traits and behaviors and worldviews and self views and decision making styles and life consequences could be attached to that misbelief? This is actually a deeply enjoyable process of discovery for most writers because at the end of it, they just feel so clear and connected to their protagonist. And that really comes through to readers and makes them fall in love with the story. Okay, let's use They Both Die at the End as an example one more time. Mateo's flaws are numerous. He's chosen to lead an isolated existence, preferring to spend his days indoors playing video games and browsing online instead of going out into the world and living and loving. As a consequence of this, Mateo only has one friend, and he's not even dared to look inside himself closely enough to really acknowledge that he's gay until the plot gets a hold of him. So, yeah, Mateo has a lot of flaws that the plot is going to try and help him change before the end. Okay, let's run through another example really quickly just to make sure you can see how all of this works together. The book that immediately popped into my head when thinking about doing this episode is Mitch Albom's new novel, The Little Liar. I absolutely love this book so much. FYI, I'm not going to spoil this novel for you, but I am going to talk about it in just a little more depth than The Dust Jacket. This novel follows 11-year-old Nico, who never lies. But when the Nazis invade his hometown, a German officer promises to reunite Nico with his family if Nico helps persuade his Jewish neighbors to board a train heading to the north to New Homes. Nico agrees to this, and he spreads the word that everything will be safe and that his neighbors should get on the trains. And because Nico never lies, most of them believe him. But as the final train arrives, Nico sees his own family being loaded into the train cars, along with his neighbors. Only then does the officer admit that he lied, and he reveals that the train is actually headed for Auschwitz and that everyone is being sent to their deaths. Nico is devastated, and after this, Nico becomes a pathological liar, never daring to tell the truth again. He spends his life hiding and changing identities and secretly trying to atone for his inadvertent lie that cost so many people their lives. So this novel has a lot of incredible themes, but with truth as the narrator, we definitely get a sense that the point does involve the idea of truth versus lies. After finishing the novel and thinking a lot about the plot and the emotional lessons learned, I'm pretty sure I found the point that Albom was trying to make. And interestingly, it's actually a direct quote from the novel. The end of a lie is always darkness. Stated another way, which is also a quote from the novel, lies will decay your soul. Okay, so that feels like a pretty solid point. It's definitely universal. There aren't many people who would argue with the fact that lies lead to bad things. Let's move on to the protagonist's misbelief. Obviously, the misbelief must be some version of the opposite of the point. In this case, I think Nico's misbelief can be stated this way. Lying is the only thing that keeps me safe from the Germans and from my own past. Now, let's move into the protagonist's wound. Interestingly, we know exactly what the wound is that caused Nico's pathological lying because the author actually explores the events in the first few chapters of the novel. We know that Nico was tricked into lying to his neighbors and family, which resulted in their deaths. And this is the wound that absolutely changed Nico's life and caused him to form his misbelief. Finally, let's talk about Nico's flaws. Nico's flaws include being a pathological liar, which resulted in him changing identities and never allowing him to get emotionally close to anyone. He doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have children, he doesn't have close friends. Though outwardly he becomes quite successful in life, he is a loner who is plagued with guilt. His life is spent in the pursuit of forgiveness. He is stuck in the past and unable to really move on. Notice how each of these elements works together and feels deeply connected and satisfying. As readers, we definitely get a strong sense of the cause and effect relationship that exists between the point, the wound, the misbelief, and the resulting flaws. Meaning, Nico's story feels real and believable because the author focused on making sure that the core structural elements were in conversation with each other. Okay, writers, I hope this episode was super helpful. Please take a moment to follow the show and share it with a writer you really care about. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now, so don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk soon.